and come back for for Professor Dummett, if that's okay with everybody. So thank you so much, and thank you for giving everybody a little taste of Vallejo. So yeah, we be right back, everybody. Thank you so much. Wow. We're having fun. So cool. Thank you. Yeah, it's just amazing being on Zoom, and everything that's been happening this year. Yeah, Pastor Quick mentioned D'Amelio. I want to thank all the scholars that have come before me, and it would not be possible to be pointing out if they had not done the research. It wouldn't be possible for me to disagree with them. And I hope that comes across. This is a wonderful book called Bayard Rustin, Troubles I've Seen. It was written by an African-American journalist in the 70s. I believe Rustin was still alive while he wrote it. Journalists write such great biographies because they tell stories, and there's great stories in that. There is also I Must Resist, Bayard Rustin's letters. One of the things, Time on Two Crosses, his writing. Bayard was a wonderful writer. One of the things I'm doing is writing a comic book about Bayard in the vein of March by Congressman John Lewis. There's just amazing dialogue, and it's just so, there is never enough time to do anything, to say everything that could be said. One of the things is called 22 Days on a Chain Gang, and I can't find it. Rustin pretty much managed to make friends with everybody on the Chain Gang. So, okay, I think everybody is back. I want to give the background of how I came about bringing in the next presenter.
Consciousness is facing today. It began to overflow in the election of Barack Obama, but its roots have been since the very first African was brought on a ship from the west coast of Africa. Now, the religious connotations, I do not think we can understand them fully until we understand that this crisis is based in history, and its history must be understood and work our way up to Bayard Rustin. I want to start with offering you a thought by Niccolo Machiavelli. In his 1531, The Prince, Machiavelli said, "Men do harm either because they fear you or because they hate you." Machiavelli in The Prince lays out this very concise, well thought out notion of power to his young prince. And yet he understands and laces this notion of power with the notion of fear. And for him, fear is that which drives and motivates people. It is the consistent and constant understanding of how men and women operate in the Western society. And I say men and women consciously because once we make our way up to modern history, we have cloistered white consciousness to white men. That's a mistake. White women are also suffering from the crisis of Western whiteness. And we see this in the fact that Donald Trump became president not just because of white men, but the overwhelming vote of white women. And as we talk about Rustin, we're going to talk about the danger of the white liberal and how the white liberal is often complicit in the maintenance of white consciousness and white superiority. Because Rustin's going to help us to understand his deep suspicion of the white liberal comes out in his understanding and power dynamics. And all of this, you may be asking, how does this come into conversation with religion? Religion is a fundamental push for power. And African-American religion is revolutionary in its orientation because it's an attempt to regain ontological power, that is, the being and presence of Blackness that has been robbed through the religious impulse. Slavery was sanctioned by the Pope. Slaves boarded ships from West Africa called Peter, Paul, and Jesus. Slavery was sanctioned in America as an opportunity for the white Christian world to save the souls of the Blackness of Africans. And so we're going to have to understand you cannot talk about Black religion and not talk about the political, because Black religion was born out of the push, the fight, the tug to gain access for Black peoples to basic humanity and the rights therein of humanity. So when we go to Machiavelli, Machiavelli helps us to understand that much of the Western formation of society is rooted and grounded in fear. And the fear of white supremacy has been tossed on cultures all across the world. And escaping that fear and the co-opting of that fear is indeed a part of the Black experience. Secondly, I turn to a notion of fear as presented by Howard Thurman, the mystic, philosopher, theologian, and also Gandhian. He says fear is one of the persistent hounds of hell that dog the footsteps of the poor, dispossessed, and disinherited. So for a good part of this conversation, I am going to take us through a genealogy. Now that genealogy is a word that I'm taking from Foucault, a French existentialist philosopher. Foucault was a philosopher of power and sexuality. And what better human being to bring into a philosophical conversation about Rustin than Foucault? Foucault helps us to understand that religion, sexuality, and power are all intertwined and all play a major role in how we understand the operations of the world and the cultures in which we find ourselves. So the three figures we will talk about today, Rustin, Thurman, and Foucault. And I hope they help us to start to have a broader conversation. Sister Anna began part of that conversation by explaining some of the intricacies of Rustin within the civil rights movement. I will explore that a little more in a bit more detail around a number of things. But first, I want to start with history, because that's where we have to ground anything and anyone that we're talking about. We all bring a history to the table. We all bring an understanding of history. We're all shaped and formed by history while we simultaneously shape and form history. If we don't understand the role history plays in our formation and the role we play in the formation of history, then we've already started to have a conversation that is not real and grounded in a certain reality around our interactions with each other. And the one who constructs history has power. For Howard Zinn helps us to understand that history has a politics. And the politics of history play a role in how we see ourselves, how others see us, and how we form and shape the future. He argues in his Politics of History that much of historical study has attempted to ignore the politics of history because the dominant forces are shaping them. And in shaping the politics of history and trying to convince us to ignore them, we accept narratives as dominant, as accurate, as truth, without questioning those narratives and the motivation behind which those narratives are created. Now, Sister Anna, I believe, has given us history. A large portion has been documented by John D'Amelio. And when we read D'Amelio, we have to understand that D'Amelio is writing a historiography that is intentionally weaving and trying to understand Rustin through the lens of his sexuality. Now, there is an understanding of that history that must be taken through there. But we also have to understand that when you shape and color history through anything, it will give you a certain perspective. So if I shape him through sexuality, is it the same as shaping him through Blackness? And is it the same as shaping him through religion? No, they are not the same. They all have a different starting point. They all have a different political axis. They all have a different goal. It's by acknowledging that, by understanding the political implications of how we want to view any individual and how we shape their history, that we are truly honest about the endeavor, and therefore we can have a truly honest conversation about the person. By trying to hide our political motivations, we are in effect lying about what those motivations ends are, and therefore cannot create a shaped and honest dialogue with the individuals we are conversing with. I am a fan of D'Amelio's version. I have read other versions. I will filter all of those versions for this conversation, yes, through the lens of Black theology, which will help us then get to some of the political understandings of who Rustin is, that I think is very important. But as I've argued, we can't get there without placing him first in history. And for that, I turn to Foucault. Foucault developed the historical construct of knowledge and power. He is against what he calls totalitarian theories. Those are large meta theories that package everything neatly into an understanding narrative. He is going to be against things like Marxism or psychoanalysis or any totalizing and unifying theory. He wants to argue that his theory, called genealogy, is running against this notion that everything makes sense, that everything is neatly packed and tight, and moves towards what he calls a totalizing criticism. In other words, Foucault wants to develop a theory that breaks up the larger narrative of power and history and knowledge and breaks it down into what I call folk knowledge, a decentralized, autonomous, and local form of understanding the way knowledge operates. This local criticism is what Foucault would call the insurrection of subjugated knowledges, or what African-American scholars like Charles Long have called opaque knowledge. That is, within Western culture has done an amazing job of hiding the knowledges of subjugated people under the totalizing knowledge of the white male patriarchal gaze. Therefore, Black people, Black religion, Black philosophy is seen through the eyes of the Western gaze, and therefore has no authentic presence of its own. How do we understand a person's life when we have not heard from the person, him or herself? Does the person want to be seen as gay or as Black or as male? How does the individual, him or herself, want to be understood from a first-person perspective? And can that person be understood without understanding the culture, the people, the environment that shaped them in their immediate construct? I live in California, but am I Californian? And do I really live in California, or do I live in Vallejo? And is Vallejo the same California as San Francisco? And is that the same California as San Diego? Is it the same California as the San Fernando Valley? Do I live in the California of Reagan and Nixon? You see, when we start to ask these questions from a Foucauldian point of view, it becomes much more complex, much more nuanced. The sort of pigeonholing that is the Western notion becomes dangerous and becomes illegitimate forms of knowledge that need to be subjugated from the totalizing notions that we hold and go down into the resources of the personal, the individual, the connectional. So that beyond the autobiography, how accurate is any narrative of us? And in the world of Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, where others can write one or two sentences about us and it becomes fact, what can we know about any individual in a culture in which we don't even take the time to converse with that individual? Here in Vallejo, it may surprise some people that I am even in this group. There is an African-American female activist who's for years tried to argue that I am the most anti-gay pastor that she has ever met, and yet has never had a conversation with me. But the notions of power and the attempt to manipulate power would have us define and pigeonhole people to take our own political interest and use those interests to tear down other people by creating a totalizing history. Rustin stands against that. And whenever you read his writings, his own writings, you read a man who is very nuanced. You meet a man who's very aware of his own agendas, take those agendas into account, and references people for who they are and where they are within their intrinsic interactions with him. And that is a deeply self-aware point of view. When you read of him, and he is complex. He is very complex. He is a human being. He has sometimes difficult relationships with some of the men he's been involved with. Sometimes toxic relationships. There's sometimes been cultures of violence around them. But name me any character in history who has done anything recorded of significance that does not have a complicated background, who does not display the flaws of humanity, and who does not engage in behavior that others can deem right or wrong, good or bad. Those are moral judgments, not ethical judgments. And there is a difference between ethics and morality. And so to finish off Foucault wants us to understand in what he called native knowledges, that there are some native knowledges that are located at the bottom of hierarchies, at the bottom of class dimensions, and that unless one understands these natives, or remember what I'm calling folk knowledges, which are regional, cultural, they're differentiated from the unanimity that one owes or one attempts to impose. These are knowledges that spring up from the bottom, out of experience, not from the top of scholarly view. They are based on material history. What exactly happened in that moment? Who was there that can contrive it? And what political leanings do they even bring? And so we, in taking a Foucaultian view, understand that there is great power in the ability to tell the story. And the power in the ability to tell the story shapes the narrative. As a Christian, my question comes, how do the Egyptians understand what happened with Moses? What would happen if we read a version of the Bible written by the Canaanites or the Perizzites? The version of the Bible we are reading comes from the Israelite community. They are describing their enemies. They are describing their battles. They are describing the land that God told them they were to take from other communities. Our history of Scripture is a history deeply bound within the Jewish community. And critical exegetical analysis would have us to ask the question, what are the people they took the land from? What did their gods tell them? And how different would the story be if they had won the wars? We hear about the battle of David and Goliath from David. Wonder what Goliath's thought was. Was Goliath trying to protect his children? We'll never know because we're not reading the version from Goliath's point of view. We're reading the version from David and his ancestors' point of view. And that's very important to understand from a critical perspective. Does it separate us from our faith? I'm going to get up Sunday morning and preach about it. But secure faith is never afraid of asking critical questions, because secure faith is grounded in something much deeper than the meta-narrative. It is grounded in relationship, not religion. And this comes to the heart of Rustin. He was not a religionist, though he inherited a grand religious tradition. And I will spend just a few moments now that I have sort of tried to demystify this notion of history and how I am going to exegete a bit of his life, not all, but just a bit. Rustin is deeply incorporated into the church. 3 churches, 3 religious traditions. The Baptist tradition, out of which his grandfather and his lineage has roots. Quakerism, out of which his great-grandfather, in the Baptist tradition, his Quaker roots, out of which his grandmother has strong religious traditions. And the Black educational tradition, primarily the AME Church. And I want to suggest that all of these elements come into play, and that all of these elements have a role in playing and developing him. I start with the Black educational tradition, because there we find the collision of the AME Church and the Quaker tradition. We find those in his education at Wilberforce in Ohio, and in his education at Cheyney State Teachers College. Wilberforce, founded by the AME Church, was an attempt to educate ex-slaves, an attempt to bring the Enlightenment onto those who were formerly enslaved. And I use the word enlightenment very carefully, because early educational and even now our modern educational system is based upon the Western Enlightenment tradition, modernity. Modernity is Europe's imposition of its meta narrative on the rest of the world. Modernity is the white male gaze that is put on ships and imported to every level of the planet. Now, the ultimate understanding of modernity and history finds itself in a man by the name of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel, in his lectures of 1920, I believe 1922 and 1930 on the philosophy of history, gives us great insight into how modernity operates. Hegel and his philosophy of history was published posthumously in 1837, but this is what he says. Africa proper, as far as history goes back, has remained for all purposes of connection with the rest of the world shut up. It is the gold land compressed within itself, the land of childhood, which lying beyond the day of self-conscious history is enveloped in the dark mantle of night. What Hegel is saying is that Africa and its peoples have no history. They lie outside of history. And since Hegel's words, Black people, Africans in the diaspora, have largely been trying to figure out how to insert themselves into Western history, how to become legitimate players in the Western discourse, how to get the American dream, how to be certified and acknowledged. This is at the root of early ex-slave education. This is at the heart of the Du Bois Booker T. Washington battle. How do we become acceptable, credible agents within the culture of white supremacy? And the reason that Rustin did not finish both schools, I would argue, points to his long and ambivalent history with his Blackness, his gayness, and the culture in which he spends his life trying to free. His radical sense of self and independence was really his problem. Not the fact that he was gay, not the fact that he was Black, but his sense that he almost, with a certain flamboyance, refused to be put into any box. And within the Western construct, you got to fit into a box. All Black preachers are this. All Black women are angry. All Black men have babies they don't take care of. We like to put people into boxes. We like to minimize them within the meta narratives of Western historical thought. And then on occasions, there are men and women who utterly refuse to be contained in the preconceived notions that one brings. Here is a young African-American male who loved classical music. He was a scholar and a star athlete. And yet, he had a penchant for his best friends and his larger amount of his community to be white. He was not socially at home within Black communities. He had a great chameleon ability to move from spaces and through spaces, and yet very few of those spaces accepted him. Many of those spaces wanted to use him for his gifts, but his complicated personality was not conformist at all. He was a behind the scenes star of the movement who never wanted to be acknowledged as a star. Indeed, early in his life, he made a commitment that he wanted greatness to be lived, not talked about. Just a word on the AME Church, founded by Richard Allen, a protest church, a church whose religious roots were aimed in saying, my personhood matters, my God has ordained it, I am fully capable of worshiping on my own without you having to determine who I am or what I am. There is a radicalism when people take their agency and their religion and use that to build upon it within the larger world. Now, another word, a word on being a Quaker. The English Civil War of the 17th century, 1742 to around 1752-51, found an upheaval in Christianity. And there were groups called seekers or searchers. And out of that came a young man named George Fox. And Fox did not really feel all of the teachings of the Church of England. He had a revelation that I don't need a church, that Christ Jesus can speak to anyone on his own terms, under his own conditions directly. That a direct experience with Christ did not need ordained clergy. And in his 1652, he had his own vision, his own great revelation, his own great awakening. And the Quakers were born out of this notion of restoring the pure church, true religion. And isn't it that every great religionist who has a revelation from God believes their revelation is taking you closer to the original God? That's part of this whole revelatory thing. My revelation gets me closer to God, then your revelation got you closer to God. Do you hear the notions of power embedded in religious practices? And if America is God's great shining example on the hill, do we not believe that power has not been embedded into American religion? So that we not only have the great crisis of the white consciousness, but we have the great crisis of the white evangelical church. The Southern Baptists are railing. They have supported a man divorced more times than a bird chirps, who's had more affairs than water in the bay, who is abusive, who does not have a track of truth in him. And yet, the Southern Baptist Church, the great evangelicals, supported President Trump. I wonder what Billy Graham is thinking from the grave as his son wraps his arms around a whoring, lying, non-religious president. The great evangelical bastion of America, Billy Graham, his son, has now betrayed every theological principle that he held. Or did he? Or did his son unveil the fact that much of Western evangelical religion was never based upon relationship with God, but based upon the wrappings of trying to keep white supremacy held in tow within the Western community? Well, nonetheless, Rustin never finished his education at either school. His pacifist beliefs based in his Quakerism is listed as one problem. Others suggest that being caught in one or two homosexual relations had him removed? We don't really know, because the man was not interested in his private life being the guiding narrative of his operations. He was not interested in being fully defined by his sexuality. And yet, we are now compelled, obsessed in some ways, with trying to understand the sex lives of people as if those are the defining narratives of their intellectual ascent. Or are they ways in which we attempt to capture, cajole, and put them in holes? These are the Foucaultian questions I have. These are the questions about power and how we understand power. Now, let me jump to something that Sister Anna raised that was a part of my lecture, and that is Martin Luther King, Rustin's relationship with King. And when we talk about history, we have to talk about it from the way it was written. Historians of the Civil Rights Movement have written about this relationship in one way. It has been written about in other ways from people who view it from the notion of sexuality. I think that this is a hybrid moment. I think hearing from Rustin himself gives us insight into how we should understand the complex and yet simple relationship that he had with the religious leader of the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King. I think his description of this is spot on, because I believe that many of us give Martin Luther King too much emotional credit. Martin Luther King was a young man thrust into intellectual life at 15 years of age. His worldview was shaped early by a dominant father. Martin Luther King was then thrust in his early 20s into a world that he was never emotionally shaped for. His first, and some would think greatest love, was a young white woman. Coretta Scott was the love that was acceptable for him to have. King's world was molded by a personality in Daddy King who was not to be trifled with. And Daddy King shaped every aspect of his life, including his emotional development. Martin Luther King was protected, upper middle class, and cloistered. He had not run the streets, not been in the clubs. He had not been exposed to what one may call underground knowledge. So he comes into contact with a man who is his polar opposite, Bayard Rustin. Their interactions were going to be complicated. And one man was going to understand the other in a way that the other could not comprehend. In 1987, Rustin had an interview in which he talked about this relationship. He says unequivocally, "My being gay was not a problem for Dr. King, but a problem for the movement." And I thought this was an amazing, nuanced way of understanding it. My being gay was not a problem for Dr. King, but a problem for the movement. Why? They both had, King and Rustin had complicated sexual lives. And both their complicated sexual lives were integrated into the larger civil rights movement. Both their complicated sexual lives were weaponized by J. Edgar Hoover. Both their complicated sexual lives, if fully exposed, to the church would have been diminishing to them. And yet, the patriarchy that's embedded in Black religion as an inheritance from white supremacy would have allowed King to get away from it, get away with it. Because the Black male preacher was allowed a certain freedom of hodom, if I were to use a folk term, that is male and patriarchal, that would never, and is still to this day, never allowed to be a part of the Black woman's narrative. Now, in order to understand this complicated sexual history within Black faith, people like Kelly Brown Douglas are instrumental. Black people, our religious orientation, and our conservatism are an attempt to escape the white dominant sexual narrative that's being created for us. From the moment we were put on ships and the moment we were recognized to be as bodies, chattel, and profit, sexuality within the white normative gaze was economic. Certain male slaves were breeders. They were created and set apart to sire as many children as possible, often through the raping of Black women. Yet, the white moralistic calculus could not accept within their own minds to be a party to rape. So what they had to do was create another historical narrative that made Black women sexually loose, immoral. That narrative had to be created to deal with the lust of white male slaveholders on Black female bodies. It was not the white male slaveholder's fault that he had mulatto babies. She is a sexual aberrant creature. So that Black sexuality has always been manipulated and warped within the power dynamics of white supremacy. And to this day, the Black church has tried to create moral codes to counteract that movement. So before we judge the church too harshly for its notions of sexual prudence, we've got to understand where that sexual prudence from, what its intent to counteract is, and as misshapen as it may be, it was an effort to try to gain control of the Black body and wrestle that control from the manipulation of white dominance. Am I justifying the conservative theology? It's not about justifying. That's a moralistic notion. I'm trying to explain the ethic, where it comes from, how it is to be understood. So the King did not have judgments on Rustin's sexuality because he was compromised himself, and because he was not raised in an environment where he understood the various sexualities. He had no contact with those various sexualities. Because in the Black community at that time, sexualities were subverted and subjected under the gaze, and therefore sexuality was not lived out loud in Black communities in most places. So that I agree on one end with Sister Anna, that he is not an absent historical figure simply because of his sexuality, because then we'd have to explain James Baldwin, whose sexuality is predominant. I think one of the reasons that he is not a major historical figure is because he chose to live a life behind the scenes. And does his sexuality subvert him some? Absolutely. We cannot doubt that. That's the reason Baldwin went to live in France, because his sexuality would not allow him to fully be integrated into the Black life of America outside of the intelligentsia that he was floating with. But many of your great Black poets, Langston Hughes and others, were all intertwined into the great Harlem Renaissance, which was not just a literary renaissance, but the Harlem Renaissance was a sexual renaissance. Alain Locke, the great philosopher, the sort of author of the New Negro, helps us to understand that the New Negro Renaissance was a new sexuality renaissance, and yet very classist, right? So that there are very real classist elements here, so that the ground level experience of Black people is not lived in the Harlem Renaissance. These are very educated, middle class Black people who find some agency through the guilt of white patrons. I know I said I wasn't going to take more than a half an hour, and my Baptist inclinations are kicked in, so I'm going to end very shortly. But this conversation between King and Rustin about whether King should form a committee comes from the Reverend Dr. Thomas Kilgore. Now, I am Californian. Where is Kilgore? Where's in LA? Kilgore and King know each other from Morehouse College. Kilgore is one of the greatest preachers in American history, unknown. Rose to become the chair of the Morehouse College Board of Trustees. I was privileged to have several conversations with Thomas Kilgore. Brilliant man. Kilgore calls the committee. The committee says, not sure, but can you imagine having an entire civil rights committee of leadership called to discuss whether your sexuality is allowed in the movement? Can you imagine what that makes one feel? Eventually, it is decided that he's not good, but listen to the nuanced language. The nuanced language suggests, and he says, I told King, rather than cause you a problem, and rather than you having to tell me to leave, I'll leave on my own. What kind of self-awareness is this? What kind of power is he recapturing? Well, this is where I'll close with Howard Thurman. Thurman talks to us in Jesus and the Disinherited about fear. And he says fear is born out of fear of the future. There are several forms of fear. He says, but ultimately fear is about a one-sided form of violence. When one group of people has the power to choose how the other group of people will be defined and operate, it is steeped in an attempt to rob one of their self-being, self-respect. It is an erasure of dignity. He says, then fear becomes a safety device, a way in which the oppressed surround themselves. They monitor their bodies. Fear is an everyday piece of the Black experience. I fear my 17-year-old son walking out the door because I don't know when he's going to come back. And Rustin is doing something amazing. He's also saying that fear is propagated by the white liberal. And he is suggesting that the white liberal co-opts the fear of the African American and uses that as a way to perpetuate themselves. He argues that much of the gains of the white liberal comes on the backs of the Black movement, and that many of the benefits of the Black movement are felt more by the white liberal than they are by the Black people who initiated those movements. And here in this city, oh my goodness, if we watch the boldness of the white woman as they can tell Black people what to do and how to feel and how to operate, as they can call city council meetings and verbally lynch a Black man because they don't like him or they don't think his politics are right. The power of the white woman liberal who is fighting for the rights of the poor Black man that they have never talked to is amazing and disgusting. And Rustin pointed it out in 1964. And we must be careful. We must be careful about our own meta narratives, thinking that we are in privileged positions to help other people. when really we should be listening to their stories. I'm going to cut it off there because I think I've given more than enough, although I have more to give, and open ourselves up for any questions or anyone who takes issue with anything. I think, Sister Anna, you're muted, so we can't hear you. Technology.
Okay, thank you. Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Pastor Quick. I gotta add one more thing about Stanley Levinson. As I mentioned, Levinson was a money man. He dumped Bayard. Levinson was an actual communist, and a lot of the pressure and smearing from J. Edgar Hoover had to do with calling people communists. Levinson could have backed away himself, which would have been very helpful. And he didn't. I think one of the lessons from that is that no ally is indispensable. We can back off. So if you're causing problems, Pastor Quick, we're gonna have to. There's just so many issues and stories and things being brought on. We have to continue this. But I'm gonna ask people. I think we can just take a 5-minute break.